Hello. Happy, what day of the week is it? I don't even know what day of the week it is anymore. Happy Tuesday. That's right, because it was a holiday weekend. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to Quarantine Storytime. I'm Charlotte, and we're back with more classic literature, War and Peace. We'll be picking up where we left off, which I should probably refresh myself and all of us. Oh, yes. We're in another battle. Part of War and Peace. Napoleon, the Battle of three emperors. The Austrian and the Russian emperor are there and are facing off against Napoleon. They think they have him on the run, but they probably don't because, yeah, Napoleon. And we end with Napoleon orders to his troops, the letter he sent them, which was to basically advance, can he be there, blah, 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 which is great. I am just going to fix something because I believe there's stuff happening. Bladder Tower. Ooh. Okay. Sorry we're starting a little bit late. I had a few things come up. So we are starting a few minutes late. I'm sorry about that. But thank you for those of you who are joining. I do have the live chat up, so feel free to say hi. Hope everyone had a great and safe holiday weekend. And yeah, and welcome to a new subscriber who is actually has to read War and Peace this summer. So hopefully we'll find this reading helpful. Hey! And of course, Mom's here. Hey, Mom. So I think we're getting really close to the end of volume 1, folks, so get excited. Woohoo! Yeah. We might even be able to get it done, like, maybe even tomorrow. Maybe we'll push through and get through the end of volume 1 tomorrow. But yeah, so Rostov was doing the night watch, and sorry, I think I might have heard thunder. That's weird. And they are getting ready to attack. Have another battle with the French. Also, I'm sorry, for some reason my video quality is like really awful today. I had a couple of Zoom classes earlier, and it's really, really dark, and I don't know what is wrong with my computer. So, thankfully this is mostly about the audio, and hopefully I can get the video quality figured out before tomorrow. It may require me shutting all my browser tabs, which could be problematic. So, all right. But anyways, like I said, I have the chat up. Say hi, and let's just jump in. So we will do Volume 1, Part 3, Section 16. At 5 o'clock in the morning, it was still quite dark. The troops of the center, the reserves, and of Bagration's right flank still stood motionless, but on the left flank, the columns of the infantry, cavalry, and artillery, which were to be the first to descend from the heights in order to attack the French right flank and drive them back to the Bohemian mountains, according to the disposition, had already begun to stir and get up from their night camp. The smoke of the bonfires, onto which everything superfluous was thrown, stung the eyes. It was cold and dark. Officers hastily drank tea and ate breakfast. Soldiers chewed on biscuits, beating their feet to warm them up. Streamed towards the bonfires, throwing onto them the remains of their lean-tos, chairs, tables, wheels, barrels, everything superfluous which it was impossible to take with them. Austrian column leaders shuttled among the Russian troops and served as heralds of the departure. As soon as an Austrian officer appeared at a regimental commander's camp, the regiment began to stir. Soldiers ran from the bonfires, stuffed pipes into boot tops, bags into wagons, took their muskets, and fell in. Officers buttoned up their coats, buckled on their swords and pouches, and strode along the ranks, calling out. Carters and orderlies harnessed, packed, and tied down the wagons. Adjutants, battalion, and regimental commanders mounted up, crossed themselves, gave final orders, instructions, and commissions to those who were staying with the train, and then the monotonous tramp of thousands of feet began. Columns started to move, not knowing where, and, owing to the surrounding people, the smoke, and the thickening fog, seeing neither the place they were leaving nor the place they were going to. A soldier in the movement is as hemmed in, limited, and borne along by his regiment as a sailor by the ship. However far he may go, whatever strange, unknown, and dangerous latitudes he gets into around him. As for the sailor, always and everywhere there are the same decks, masts, riggings of his ship. Always everywhere there are the same comrades, the same ranks, the same Sergeant Major Ivan Mitrich, the same company dog, Zukka, the same superiors. A soldier rarely wishes to know what latitudes his whole ship has gotten to, but on the day of the battle, God knows how and from where, a stern note is heard in the moral world of the troops, the same for everyone, which sounds the approach of something decisive and solemn, and arouses in them an unaccustomed curiosity. On the day of battle, soldiers excitedly try to get beyond the interests of their regiment, listen intently, look about, and greedily inquire into what is going on around them. The fog was so thick that though day was breaking, one could not see 10 paces ahead. Bushes looked like enormous trees, level places like cliffs and slopes. Everywhere, on all sides, one might run into an enemy invisible 10 paces away. But the columns marched for a long time through the same fog, going down and up hills, past gardens and fences, over new, incomprehensible terrain, without coming across the enemy anywhere. On the contrary, the soldiers realized that ahead, behind, on all sides, our Russian columns were moving in the same direction. Every soldier felt pleased at heart, knowing that many, many more Russian soldiers were going to be where he was. That is, no one knew where. "See there, the Kursky lads just marched by," came from one of the ranks. "It's scary, brother, the troops we've gathered. Last night I looked, and when they lit the fires, there's no end of them. Moscow, in short." Though none of the column leaders rode up to the ranks and spoke to the soldiers, the column leaders, as we saw at the Council of War, were ill-humored and displeased with the action undertaken, and therefore were only following orders and did not bother cheering up the soldiers. Despite that, the soldiers marched on cheerily, as always when going into action, especially on the offensive. But having gone for about an hour in thick fog, the major part of the troops were forced to halt, and an unpleasant awareness of disorder and muddle-headedness passed through the ranks. How such awareness is conveyed is quite difficult to define, but it is unquestionable that it is conveyed with extraordinary sureness, and flows swiftly, imperceptibly, and irresistibly, like water through a glen. If the Russian army had been alone, without allies, much time still might have passed before this awareness of disorder became a general conviction. But now, ascribing the cause of the disorder with particular pleasure and naturalness to the muddle-headed Germans, everyone became convinced that the harmful confusion taking place was the doing of the sausage-makers. "What's the hold-up? Is the way blocked, or are we already run into the French? No, doesn't sound like, otherwise they'd have started shooting." So they were in a hurry to get started, but once they got started, here we stand, witless in the middle of a field. It's all these cursed Germans confusing things. What muddle-headed devils! So I'd have let them take the lead, but no, they huddle in the rear, and now we stand here on empty stomachs. "Well, how long will it be? They say the cavalry's blocked the road," said an officer. The cursed Germans, they don't know their own country," said another. "What division are you?" an adjutant shouted, riding up. "The 18th. "Then what are you doing here? You should be gone ahead long ago. Now you won't get through till evening. Stupid orders. Such stupid orders. They don't know what they're doing themselves," the officer said and rode off. Then a general rode by and angrily shouted something not in Russian. "Tafa lafa, and there's no telling what he's mumbling," a soldier said, mimicking the general as he rode off. "I'd shoot the scoundrels." "We were ordered to be in place before 9, but we're not halfway there. What orders?" was repeated from different sides. and the feeling of energy with which the troops had set out for action began to turn into vexation and anger at the muddle-headed orders and the Germans. The reason for the confusion was that, while the Austrian cavalry was moving on the left flank, the superior officers decided that our center was too far from the right flank, and the entire cavalry was ordered to cross over to the right. Several thousand cavalry were advancing ahead of the infantry, and the infantry was forced to wait. At the head, a confrontation took place between an Austrian column leader and a Russian general. The Russian general shouted, demanded that the cavalry be stopped. The Austrian insisted that the fault lay not with him, but with the superior officers. The troops meanwhile stood there, bored and losing heart. After an hour's delay, the troops finally moved on and began to descend the hill. The fog, which was lifting on the hilltops, only grew thicker in the bottom where the troops were descending. At the head, in the fog, a shot rang out. Then another, at first irregularly, at various intervals, trat-tat-tat, and then more regularly and rapidly, and the action at the Gold Box stream began. Not counting on meeting the enemy below by the stream and coming upon them by chance in the fog, hearing not a word of encouragement from the superior officers, with the awareness spreading through the troops that they were late, and above all, seeing nothing ahead or around them in the thick fog, the Russians lazily and slowly exchanged fire with the enemy, moved forward and again halted, not receiving timely orders from the officers and adjutants, who wandered through the fog over the unfamiliar terrain, unable to find their units. Thus the action began for the first, second, and third columns, which had descended the hill. The fourth column, with which Kutuzov himself was, occupied the Pratzen Heights. In the bottom where the action began, the fog was thick. Up above, it had cleared, but nothing of what was happening ahead could be seen. Whether all the enemy forces were 6 miles away from us, as we supposed, or were there in the fog, no one knew till past 8 o'clock. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. An unbroken sea of fog spread below, but at the village of Schloppenitz, on the heights where Napoleon stood, surrounded by his marshals, it was perfectly light. Over him was the clear blue sky, and the enormous ball of the sun, like an enormous, hollow, crimson float, bobbed on the surface of a milky sea of fog. The whole French army, including Napoleon himself and his staff, not only were not on the far side of the streams and bottomland of the villages of Sokolnitz and Schlappenitz, where we intended to take up a position and begin the action, but were on the near side, so close to our troops that Napoleon, with his naked eye, could distinguish between our troops on horseback and on foot. Napoleon sat a little in front of his marshals, on a small gray Arabian horse, in his dark blue greatcoat, the same in which he had made the Italian campaign. He peered silently at the hills, which seemed to rise up from the sea of fog, over which Russian troops were moving in the distance. He listened to the sounds of gunfire in the hollow. On his face, still lean at the time, not a muscle stirred. His glistening eyes were fixed motionlessly on one place. His conjectures turned out to be correct. Part of the Russian army had already descended into the hollow towards the ponds and lakes. Part was still clearing off from the Pratzen Heights, which he intended to attack and considered the key to the position. He saw amidst the fog, in the depression between the two hills, near the village of Pratz, Russian columns, their bayonets glittering, moving all in one direction towards the hollows, and disappearing one after another into the sea of fog. From the information he had received in the evening, from the sound of wheels and footsteps heard during the night at the outposts, from the disorderly movement of the Russian columns, from all his conjectures, he saw clearly that the Allies considered him to be far ahead of them, that the columns moving near Pratz constituted the center of the Russian army, and that the center was already sufficiently weakened for him to attack it successfully, but he still did not begin the action. That day was a solemn day for him, the anniversary of his coronation. Before morning, he had dozed off for a few hours, and, healthy, cheerful, fresh, and in a state of mind in which everything seems possible and everything succeeds, he mounted his horse and rode out into the field. He stood motionless, gazing at the heights appearing from the fog, and on his cold face there was the particular tinge of self-confident, well-deserved happiness that can be seen on the face of a boy who has happily fallen in love. His marshal stood behind him, not daring to distract his attention. He looked now at the Pratzen Heights, now with the sun floating out of the fog. When the sun had fully emerged from the fog and its dazzling brilliance sprayed over the field and the fog, it was as if he had only been waiting for that to begin the action. He took the glove from his beautiful white hand, made a signal to the marshals, and gave the order for the action to begin. The marshals, accompanied by adjutants, galloped off in various directions, and a few minutes later the main forces of the French army were moving swiftly towards those same prots and heights from which the Russian troops had cleared off more and more, descending to the left into the hollow. Section 15. At 8 o'clock, Kutuzov rode to Prats at the head of the Miloradovich fourth column, the one which was to take the place of the columns of Pyaisker, Byzukski, and Langeron, which had already gone down. He greeted the men of the head regiment and gave the order to move, thus showing that he intended to lead the column himself. Having ridden to the village of Prats, he halted. Prince Andrei, one of the enormous number of persons constituting the commander-in-chief's suite, stood behind him. Prince Andrei felt excited, irritated, and at the same time restrainedly calm, as a man usually is when a long-desired moment comes. He was finally convinced that this was the day of his Toulon, or his bridge of Arcole. How it would happen he did not know, but he was firmly convinced it would be so. The locality and the position of our troops were known to him, as far as they could be known to anyone in our army. His own strategic plan, which there obviously could be no thought of carrying out now, was forgotten. Now entering into Weyrother's plan, Prince Andrei pondered the possible happenstances and came up with new considerations, such as might call for his swiftness of reflection and decisiveness. To the left below, in the fog, exchanges of fire between unseen troops could be heard. There, it seemed to Prince Andrei, a battle would concentrate. There an obstacle would be encountered. And it's there that I'll be set with a brigade or a division, and there, with a standard in my hand, I'll go forward and crush everything ahead of me. Prince Andrei could not look with indifference at the standards of the battalions going past him. Looking at a standard, he thought, maybe it is that very standard that I'll have to march at the head of the troops. By morning, the night's fog had left only hoarfrost turning into dew on the heights, but in the hollows the fog could still spread its milk-white sea. Nothing could be seen in that hollow to the left, into which our troops had descended and from which came the sound of gunfire. Over the heights was a dark, clear sky, and to the right the enormous ball of the sun. Far ahead, on the other shore of the sea of fog, one could make out the jutting, wooded hills on which the enemy army was supposed to be, and something was discernible. To the right, the guards were entering the region of fog, with a sound of tramping and wheels and occasional gleams of bayonets. To the left, beyond the village, similar masses of cavalry approached and disappeared into the sea of fog. In front and behind moved the infantry. The commander-in-chief stood on the road out of the village, letting the troops pass by. Kutuzov seemed exhausted and irritable that morning. The infantry going past him halted without any command, apparently because something ahead held them up. But tell them firmly to form into battalions and go around the village, Kutuzov said angrily to a general who rode up. Don't you understand, Your Excellency, my dear sir, that to stretch out in a defile through the street village is impossible when we're marching against an enemy? I intended to form them up outside the village, Your Excellency, said the general. Kutuzov laughed biliously. A fine sight you'd be, lining up in view of the enemy. A very fine sight. The enemy's still far off, Your Excellency, according to the disposition. The disposition? Kutuzov exclaimed biliously. Who told you that? Kindly do as you're ordered. Yes, sir. Mon cher, Nowitzki said to Prince Andrei in a whisper. Le vieux est d'une humeur de chien. An Austrian officer in a white uniform with green plumes on his hat rode up to Kutuzov and asked on behalf of the emperor whether the fourth column had started into action. Kutuzov turned away without answering him, and his gaze glanced to rest on Prince Andrei, who was standing close by. Seeing Bolkonsky, Kutuzov softened the angry and caustic expression of his gaze, as if aware that his adjutant was not to blame for what was going on. And, without answering the Austrian adjutant, he addressed Bolkonsky. Allez voir, mon cher, si la troisième division en dépasse le village, dis-lui de s'arrêter et d'attendre mes ordres. Prince Andrei had only just started when he stopped. Et demandez-lui si les tirailleurs sont postes, he added. Ce qu'ils font, he said to himself, still not answering the Austrian. Prince Andrei galloped off to carry out his mission. Overtaking all the advancing battalions, he stopped the 3rd Division and ascertained that there was, in fact, no line of riflemen in front of our columns. The regimental commander of the front regiment was very surprised by the order conveyed to him from the commander-in-chief to send out riflemen. The regimental commander stood there in full conviction that there were more troops ahead of him and that the enemy was no less than 6 miles away. In fact, nothing could be seen ahead but the empty terrain sloping away and covered with thick fog. Having ordered on behalf of the commander-in-chief that the omission be rectified, Prince Andrei galloped back. Kutuzov still stood in the same place, and, his corpulent body sagging over the saddle in an old man's fashion, yawned deeply, closing his eyes. The troops were no longer moving, but stood at parade rest. Very good, he said to Prince Andrei, and turned to a general who stood there with a watch in his hand, saying it was time to move on because all the columns of the left flank had already descended. We still have time, Your Excellency, Kutuzov said through a yawn. We still have time, he repeated. Just then, from well behind Kutuzov, came shouts of regimental greetings, and these voices began to approach quickly along the whole extended line of the advancing Russian columns. It was clear that the one being greeted was riding quickly. When the soldiers of the regiment Kutuzov was standing in front of began to shout, he rode slightly to one side and, wincing, turned to look. Down the road from Prats galloped what looked like a squadron of varicolored horsemen. 2 of them rode side by side at a great gallop ahead of the rest. One, in a black uniform with white plumes, rode a bobtail chestnut horse. The other, in a white uniform, rode a black horse. These were the 2 emperors with their suite. Kutuzov, with the affectation of a front-line veteran, ordered his troops to attention, and saluting, rode up to the emperor. His whole figure and manner suddenly changed. He acquired the look of a subordinate, unthinking man. With affected deference, which obviously struck the Emperor Alexander unpleasantly, he rode up and saluted him. The unpleasant impression, like the remnants of the fog in a clear sky, passed over the emperor's young and happy face and disappeared. He was somewhat thinner that day, after his illness, than on the field of Olmütz, where Bolkonsky had seen him for the first time abroad. But there was the same enchanting combination of majesty and mildness in his beautiful gray eyes, and the fine lips had the same possibility of various expressions, with a prevalent expression of good-natured, innocent youth. At the Olmütz review, he was more majestic. Here, he was more cheerful and energetic. He was slightly flushed after galloping 2 miles, and reining in his horse, gave a sigh of relief and looked around at the faces of his suite, as young, as animated as his own. Czartoryski and Novosiltsev and Prince Volkonsky and Stroganov and the others, all richly clad, cheerful young men on splendid, pampered, fresh, only slightly sweaty horses, talking and smiling, stopped behind the sovereign. The Emperor Franz, a ruddy, long-faced young man, sat extremely straight on his handsome black stallion and looked around him with a preoccupied, unhurried air. He called up one of his white adjutants and asked something. Most likely what time they started, thought Prince Andrei, observing his old acquaintance and recalling his audience with a smile he was unable to repress. In the emperor's suite there were picked fine young orderly officers, Russian and Austrian, from the guards and infantry regiments. Among them were grooms leading the handsome spare horses of the royalty in embroidered clothes. As fresh air from the fields suddenly breathes through an open window onto a stuffy room, so youth, energy, and certainty of success breathed upon Kutuzov's cheerless staff as these brilliant young men galloped up. "Why don't you begin, Mikhail Leonovich?" the Emperor Alexander hurriedly addressed Kutuzov, at the same time glancing courteously at the Emperor Franz. "I am waiting, Your Majesty," said Kutuzov, inclining deferentially. The Emperor cupped his ear, frowning slightly and showing that he had not heard properly. "I'm waiting, Your Majesty," Kutuzov repeated. Prince Andrei noticed that Kutuzov's upper lip twitched unnaturally as he said this, waiting. "Not all the columns are assembled, Your Majesty." The sovereign heard, but this reply clearly did not please him. He shrugged his slightly stooping shoulders, glanced at Novositsev, who stood nearby, as if complaining of Kutuzov by this glance. "We're not on the Tsaritsyn field, Mikhail Aronovich, where you don't start a parade until all the regiments are assembled," said the sovereign, again glancing into the eyes of the Emperor Franz, as though inviting him, if not to take part, at least to listen to what he was saying. But the Emperor Franz went on looking around and did not listen. "That is just why I do not begin, sire," Kutuzov said in a ringing voice, as if to forestall the possibility of not being heard, and again something twitched in his face. "I do not begin, sire, because we are not on parade and not on the Tsaritsyn field," he uttered clearly and distinctly. All the faces in the sovereign suite instantly exchanged glances with each other, expressing murmur and reproach. Old as he may be, he simply should not speak that way, these faces expressed. The sovereign looked fixedly and attentively into Kutuzov's eyes, waiting to see if he would say something more, but Kutuzov, for his part, bowed his head deferentially and also seemed to be waiting. The silence lasted for about a minute. "However, if you order it, Your Majesty," said Kutuzov, raising his head and again changing his tone to that of a dull, unthinking, but obedient general. He touched up his horse and called to him the column leader, Miloradovich, gave him the order to advance. The troops stirred again, and the 2 battalions of Novgorodsky Regiment and a battalion of Apsheronsky Regiment moved on past the sovereign. While this Apsheronsky battalion was marching by, ruddy-faced Miloradovich, with no greatcoat, in his uniform tunic and decorations and a hat with enormous plumes, worn at an angle and brim first, galloped ahead, humped to, and with a dashing salute reined in his horse before the sovereign. "God be with you, General," said the sovereign. "Ma foi, sire, nos ferons ce qui sera dans notre possibilité, sire," he replied merrily, nevertheless calling up mocking smiles among the gentlemen of the suite with his bad French. "Just like me." Miloradovich turned his horse sharply and placed himself slightly behind the sovereign. The Apsheronsky, excited by the presence of the sovereign, marched past the emperors and their suite at a dashingly brisk pace, beating their feet. "Lads!" cried Miloradovich in a loud, self-assured, and merry voice, obviously so excited by the sounds of gunfire and the anticipation of battle, and the sight of his gallant Apsheronsky, his companions from Suvorov's time, marching briskly past the emperors, that he forgot the sovereign's presence. "Lads, it won't be the first village you've taken," he shouted. "We do our best, sir," the soldiers shouted out. The sovereign's horse shied at the sudden shout. This horse, who had carried the sovereign at reviews while still in Russia, also carried her rider here, on the field of Austerlitz, and during the distracted nudges of his left foot, pricked up her ears at the sound of gunshots just as she did on the field of Mars, understanding neither the meaning of the shout she heard, nor the presence of the Emperor Franz's black stallion, nor anything of what her rider said, thought, or felt that day. The sovereign turned with a smile to one of his retinue, pointing to the gallant Apsheronsky, and said something to him. Section 16. Kutuzov, accompanied by his adjutants, rode at a walk behind the carabiners. Having gone less than half a mile at the tail of the column, he stopped by a solitary, deserted house, probably a former tavern, where the road forked. Both's road went down the hill, and troops were marching along both. The fog began to lift, and the enemy troops could be dimly seen about a mile and a half away on the heights opposite. To the left, below, the gunfire was growing louder. Kutuzov stopped, talking with an Austrian general. Prince Andrei, standing slightly behind him, peered at the enemy and turned to an adjutant, wishing to borrow a field glass from him. Look, said this adjutant, looking not at the distant troops, but down the hill in front of him. "It's the French!" The two generals and the adjutants began snatching at the field glass, pulling it away from each other. All their faces suddenly changed, and on all of them horror appeared. The French were supposed to be 1.5 miles from us, and they suddenly turned up right in front of us. Is it the enemy? No. Yes, look, he's for certain. What is that? The voices said. With his naked eye, Prince Andrei saw below, to the right, a dense column of French coming up to meet the Apsherontsy, no further than 500 paces from where Kutuzov was standing. Here it is. The decisive moment has come. Now it's my turn, thought Prince Andrei. And spurring his horse, he rode to Kutuzov. The Apsherontsy must be stopped, Your Excellency, he cried. But at that same moment, everything became covered with smoke. There was the sound of gunfire nearby, and a naively frightened voice 2 steps from Prince Andrei cried, Well, brothers, that's it for us. It was as if this voice was a command, and at this voice, everyone began to run. Confused, ever-increasing crowds came running back to the place where, 5 minutes before, the troops had marched past the emperors. Not only was it difficult to stop this crowd, but it was impossible not to yield and move back with it. Bolkonsky tried only not to be separated from Kutuzov and looked around in perplexity, unable to understand what was happening in front of him. Novitzky, looking angry, red, and not like himself, shouted to Kutuzov that if he did not leave at once, he would certainly be taken prisoner. Kutuzov stood in the same place and, without responding, took out his handkerchief. Blood was flowing from his cheek. Prince Andrei forced his way to him. Are you wounded? He asked, barely able to control the trembling of his lower jaw. The wound isn't here, it's there, said Kutuzov, pressing the handkerchief to his wounded cheek and pointing to the fleeing men. Stop them, he cried, and at the same moment, probably realizing that it was impossible to stop them, spurred his horse and rode to the right. A fresh crowd of fleeing men streamed past, caught him up, and carried him backwards. The troops were fleeing in such a dense crowd that once one landed in the middle of it, it was difficult to get out. Someone shouted, Keep going, don't drag your feet. Another, turning around, fired into the air. Someone else struck the horse on which Kutuzov himself was riding. Extricating themselves with the greatest effort from the flow of the crowd to the left, Kutuzov and his suite, diminished by more than half, rode towards the sound of nearby cannon fire. Extricating himself from the crowd of fleeing men, Prince Andrei, trying to keep up with Kutuzov, saw on the slope of the hill, amidst the smoke, a Russian battery still firing, and the French running up to it. Slightly higher stood Russian infantry, neither moving ahead to aid the battery nor backwards in direction of the fugitives. A general on horseback separated himself from the infantry and rode up to Kutuzov. There were only 4 men left in Kutuzov's suite. They were all pale and exchanged glances silently. Stop those villains, Kutuzov said, breathlessly to the regimental commander, pointing to the fleeing men. But at the same moment, as if in punishment for those words, bullets like a flock of birds flew whistling at the regiment and Kutuzov's suite. The French had attacked the battery, and seeing Kutuzov, were shooting at him. With this volley, the regimental commander seized his leg. Several soldiers fell, and an ensign, holding a standard, let it drop from his hands. The standard wavered and fell, stopped momentarily by the bayonets of the soldiers around it. The soldiers began firing without any orders. Oh! Kutuzov moaned with an expression of despair and looked around. Bolkonsky, he whispered, in a voice trembling with awareness of his old man's strengthlessness. Bolkonsky, he whispered, pointing to the disordered battalion and the enemy. What's going on? Before he finished saying it, Prince Andrei, feeling sobs of shame and anger rising in his throat, was already jumping off his horse and running towards the standard. Forward, lads, he cried in a childishly shrill voice. Here it is, thought Prince Andrei, seizing the staff of the standard and hearing with delight the whistles of bullets, evidently aimed precisely at him. Several soldiers fell. Hurrah! Cried Prince Andrei, barely able to hold up the heavy standard, and he ran forward with unquestioning assurance that the entire battalion would run after him. And indeed, he ran only a few steps alone. One soldier started out, another, and the whole battalion, with a shout of hurrah, rushed forward and overtook him. A sergeant of the battalion ran up, took the standard that was wavering in Prince Andrei's hand because of its weight, but was killed at once. Prince Andrei again seized the standard and, dragging it by the staff, ran with the battalion. Ahead of him he saw our artillerists, some of whom were firing, while others abandoned the cannon and came running in his direction. He also saw French infantrymen who had seized the artillery horses and were turning the cannon. Prince Andrei and his battalion were now 20 paces from the cannon. Above him he heard the unceasing whistle of bullets, and soldiers ceaselessly gasped and fell to right and left of him. But he did not look at them. He looked fixedly only at what was happening ahead of him, at the battery. He clearly saw the figure of a red-haired gunner, his shako knocked askew, pulling a swab from one side, while a French soldier pulled it towards him from the other side. Prince Andrei saw clearly the bewildered and at the same time angry expression on the faces of the two men, who evidently did not understand what they were doing. What are they doing? Prince Andrei wondered, looking at them. Why doesn't the red-haired artillerist run away, since he has no weapon? Why doesn't the Frenchman stab him? Before he runs away, the Frenchman will remember his musket and bayonet him. In fact, another Frenchman with his musket, a tilt, ran up to the fighting men, and the lot of the French-haired artillerist, who still did not understand what awaited him, and had triumphantly pulled the swab from the French soldier's hands, was about to be decided. But Prince Andrei did not see how it ended. It seemed to him as though one of the nearest soldiers, with the full swing of a stout stick, hit him on the head. It was slightly painful and, above all, unpleasant, because the pain distracted him and kept him from seeing what he had been looking at. What is it? Am I falling? Are my legs giving way under me? He thought, and fell on his back. Holding his eyes, hoping to see how the fight between the French and the artillerists ended, and wishing to know whether or not the red-haired artillerist had been killed, whether the cannon had been taken or saved. But he did not see anything. There was nothing over him now except the sky. The lofty sky, not clear, but still immeasurably lofty, with great clouds slowly creeping across it. How quiet, calm, and solemn, not at all like when I was running, thought Prince Andrei. Not like when we were running, shouting and fighting, not at all like when the Frenchmen and the artillerists, with angry and frightened faces, were pulling at the swab. It's quite different the way the clouds creep across this lofty, infinite sky. How is it I haven't seen this lofty sky before? And how happy I am that I've finally come to know it. Yes, everything is empty. Everything is a deception except this infinite sky. There is nothing except that. There is not even that. There is nothing except silence, tranquility, and thank God. And we will pause there on that introspective note for today. And we will leave to pick up that battle again tomorrow, which I do suppose, as I said, we may be able to finish this part and this last end of Volume 1, which would be an excellent bit of progress. So thank you guys for tuning in. I don't know if you can hear, but there's a bit of thunder here, so it's kind of given this battle charge an extra bit of reading. I wish I could have that thunder rolling in the background of every time I have to read a battle. It certainly adds a level of drama to it. And again, I'm sorry for the poor video quality. I have no idea what's going on, and we'll be checking with my computer this afternoon to see how I can possibly have it fixed for tomorrow, but hopefully the audio has been okay. And thank you all again. Feel free to leave any questions or comments in the comments of the video. And very interesting. So Prince Andrei is getting his valiant moment to define himself carrying the standard. And it's pretty funny that it was like almost too heavy for him to hold. As I thought was perhaps one of the most ironic moments so far. And it seemed like the Russians were not, as we surmised before, that the Russians were not properly prepared for the French who were waiting, and the French had the advantage. So we'll just see how that advantage plays out when we pick up again tomorrow. So thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe out there.